1, 2, 3.
The following audio exclusive features the entire Uncut interview with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Noam Chomsky. This conversation was featured in our recent episode, AOC and Noam Chomsky, The Way Forward.
We are talking at a moment in history, a very particular moment when all sort of long-held assertions about markets and governments and even our relationship to one another and to nature seem to be loosening their grip. The manufacturers of consent, as one of our guests today once dubbed them, no longer seem to have quite so much control over what everyday people do and think. Millions of workers are refusing to work or believe what authorities say. Others are rising up against the odds against racist police, powerful sexist guys, and even border guards on horseback with whips. All sorts of things that were once unthinkable are now being thought. Our guests are lifelong dissenters who have always talked about such things. Coming from different backgrounds, contexts, and generations, they have this in common. They demand that we think differently about everything from our nation's history and its place in the world to who can run for office in this country and win. Some of these unthinkables, like that last one, are pretty exciting. Others are terrifying, like the thought that the human race just may be teetering on a terminal brink. To discuss all of this, in its frightening as well as its exciting possibilities, two people who actually really do need no introduction. MIT professor emeritus, author, and public intellectual Noam Chomsky, and native from the Bronx, representing New York's 14th, the Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Welcome both. I am so glad to have you. And I'm going to come to Noam in a minute to talk about the new unthinkables at the level of political discourse, and to talk about the new unthinkable possibles in government. But first, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time you two have actually met. So do you have anything you want to say to each other? Maybe Noam, start.
Sort of met, virtually met. That's a step forward. I hope there'll be an actual chance. I've been greatly admiring what you've been doing, following it closely. It's a real pleasure to be sort of with you.
No, of course, and likewise. It's absolutely, I think, it's such an honor and a culminating moment to be able to engage with the one and only Professor Chomsky. And I greatly look forward to, us being able to move as a society past this pandemic so that we can engage in person.
I can't wait for that. I hope I'm there. Well, so Noam, starting with you. You and I, for better or worse, have talked on and off for about 30 years. And in that time, there's always been, as you put it, a kind of long list of unthinkable thoughts in America. And yet, just today, I read in one of our newspapers of record, the New York Times, that workers have real power, that the economy just might need some sort of planning, and that just possibly leaving so many things to markets isn't the best idea, especially when it comes to the environment, healthcare, you name it. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Is something shifting? And when you think of the unthinkables, what's changed and what hasn't, in your view?
Well, we should first of all recognize that we've been living through about 45 years of a particular socioeconomic political system, what's called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has a formal definition, pretty much what you said, reliance on markets and so on. That's almost total fraud. That's not neoliberalism. There was never reliance on markets. The so-called free trade agreements are radically protectionist. We're seeing that right now in front of our eyes with the virtual monopoly on drugs. The what we've really had for the 45 years is what some economists have called a bailout economy. Ever since Reagan's deregulation, we have the obvious consequences, financial crisis after financial crisis. Every time it comes, there's the kindly taxpayer bails out the perpetrators. Notice that it's one-sided. So, for example, the TARP agreement, W. Bush and Obama, had two elements to it. One was to bail out the perpetrators of the crisis with predatory loans and so on. The other was to provide support for the victims of the crisis, people who had lost their homes, lost their jobs, and so on. Which one of the two was implemented? Only the first. And that illustrates what neoliberalism really is. It's class war.
But Noam, years ago, you couldn't even say the word neoliberalism, let alone socialism. We didn't talk about systems of our economy. Today, I think we are. What is still beyond the bounds?
We also did 60, 70 years ago. So Eisenhower, who was not known as a flaming liberal, said that anyone who doesn't accept New Deal policies, anyone who doesn't believe that workers have the right freely to organize without suppression, any such person doesn't belong in our political system. Well, that was the 1950s. It changed beginning with a little bit with Carter, then the dike broke with Reagan and Thatcher. And since then, we've been living in the kind of system that you described. One-sided class war. Actually, we even have a measure of its consequences. The Rand Corporation, a couple months ago, super respectable, tried to estimate the transfer of wealth, putting it more plainly, robbery. The robbery of the lower 90% of the population by the top, actually fraction of 1%. Their estimate over the neoliberal period is close to $50 trillion, which is a significant underestimate. Reagan opened the spigots on lots of other ways to rob the public, tax havens, shell companies, all sorts of devices. It's another couple of tens of trillions of dollars. So it's one-sided class war. Markets for the poor, protection for the rich.
But now we talk about it. And it does seem to me there's been a shift. And I want to come to you on this, AOC. I have interviewed you before, and that was when you were just running for office for a panel about young people in politics. For an indication of how much has changed in terms of what's possible, I recall with my chagrin that even I, a confirmed optaholic, ended that interview saying, well, but if you don't win this time, will you run again? I thought it likely that you might not be victorious against powerful Joe Crowley that first time, but you were, and you're not alone. Has a dam broken, do you think?
I do think that there is a dam breaking, both in electoral politics, but also in organizing beyond our electoral system, like what we're seeing with the precipitation of strikes on a scale that really has not been seen in many years. And I think it's a bit of an emperor with no clothes type of situation for our political establishment and our capitalist systems, where people are beginning to realize that once we name these systems and describe them, that this water that people have been swimming in actually has a name, and there is alternatives, that people can come up for air if we try to explore alternative ways of doing things. And I think that, after I won, there was such a large concerted attempt and continues to be a large concerted attempt by media to marginalize not just my victory, but what happened in our community. This was a fluke. It was you had the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, within days saying this was a complete accident. You had every major elected official and Democratic Party member trying to dismiss what happened. And the thing is that it didn't stop. There would be a case for that if I was the only victory that occurred. But the fact of the matter is that simply wasn't the case. We then had the election of people also naming systems and talking about what was previously extraordinarily politically taboo, the election of individuals like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, then again, the next cycle with Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones. And it really seems as though there is a crack that is starting to metastasize. And again, this not just applies electorally, but we're starting to see this with people recognizing the true power in techniques like withholding their labor or shutting down streets during the racial uprisings last year.
Noam, what do you think? I mean, when you called AOC's election, when the Congresswoman was elected, you call it spectacular and significant.
Very much. It's a sign that the one-sided class war of the last 40 years is becoming two-sided. The population is actually beginning to participate instead of just accepting the hammer blows. It's worth remembering that Reagan and Thatcher both understood that when you're going to launch a major attack on working people, poor, minorities, and others, you have to eliminate their defenses. And that was done in many ways. The first moves of Reagan and Thatcher were to severely attack the labor movement by illegal means, in fact, opening the door for the corporate sector to do the same. That's eliminating the main way in which people can defend themselves. Labor has always been in the forefront of defense of the population against attack. You started by saying something very important. The refusal of workers today to go back to rotten jobs created for them by this assault. That's a strike, basically. We now are having a huge strike, one of the major strikes in American history, when workers are simply saying, we're not going to go back to the rotten, oppressive jobs, precarious, rotten circumstances, no health. We're just not going to accept it. Mm-hmm. And that's a major factor in the economy now. And yes, it's a strike, and it's showing up in other ways too. There are, for example, the last year, the teacher strikes were quite important. These are non-unionized, red states, tremendous popular support. I happen to live in Arizona, where one of them was, signs on every lawn supporting the teachers. Not a radical state by any means. They were not just calling for better wages, which they greatly deserve, but for saving the children, saving the public school, public education, which has been under severe attack for 45 years. Milton Friedman, the guru of the neoliberal movement, was openly in favor of destroying the public education system. Under Trump, for the first time in history, the Secretary of Education was opposed to education, wanted to eliminate the public school system. Well, the teachers are saying, we're not going to take it anymore.
The same is happening in healthcare. In your constituency and across the country, Congresswoman, you have nurses who know about the critique that's going to come their way, but are nonetheless saying, actually, we can't operate with these kinds of nurse-patient ratios. We can't operate without the protective devices that we need. We've seen that throughout the pandemic, both the courageous service and the courageous withholding of service at times. What are you seeing on that front? And what do you think is going to come of this? Because I have to say, industrial unions came out of industrial economies. Today, we have this kind of Bezos economy, Amazon economy, and service economies that aren't organized, most of them, in the same way.
I think, this is such an excellent question. And when we talk about systems that are being named, what is so intertwined in this discussion is that this is not just also about open critiques of capitalism, but also open critiques of white supremacy and greater understanding of white supremacy, not as just, these racist social clubs of people donning hoods, but actually as a system and a system's understanding of how white supremacy has interacted with the development of the United States. And so the way that ties back in is that so many of these essential labor forces are dominated by women and women of color, whether it's fast food workers or whether it's nurses or whether it's childcare and teaching professions. What I would say this capitalist class calls a labor shortage, what is actually a dignified work shortage, is concentrated overwhelmingly in working class people, a multiracial working class, but also in professions that are dominated by women and women of color, and which is why you see this precipitous drop and the greatest difficulty in people who are in essentially refilling this job are women. And so when we really intertwine our understanding of both of these systems, that presents to us and illuminates a lot of not just the problems that are happening, but the solutions. Because similar to the wildcat strikes with teachers in places like West Virginia, these nurses who are starting to stand up and refuse the conditions that they're having are protecting our systems. Because if they did not do that, then we would have a collapse, because the rubber will meet the road eventually. And these strikes, I see as many people standing up to prevent a complete fallout of that labor sector. And so the demands for dignity in our work are frankly demands for sustainability of our society. And they know that that's not going to come from the top. We have seen, even from the fossil fuel industry, that oil and coal and fossil fuel barons will burn their fuels and reap their profits until our species is extinct, if they could. And so we are seeing this resistance, but this resistance is really a defense of society.
There's two things coming out of that. We want to get to the climate, and I will. But before we go there, Noam, I do want to underscore something that the Congresswoman just said. When I came into talking with you in the early 90s, there was a miserable and acrimonious backlash, even on the left, against what was then dismissed as annoying identity politics. What I'm hearing now in every corner is that people are getting it, as the Congresswoman just said, unless we address the power of white male supremacy, we're not going to get the changes that we need. Do you agree there's been a shift on that front? And are there things that you've learned in relation to that over your long career?
There's a change. We should recognize that white male supremacy is a deep current in American history. It's not going to go away immediately. But there have been dents, significant ones. So, for example, even in the mainstream, when the New York Times ran the 1619 Project, that couldn't have happened a couple of years earlier. And it's because of changes in general consciousness and awareness. Of course, there was an immediate backlash, strong backlash. And you're going to expect that. White male supremacy is a deep part of American history and culture. To extirpate it is not going to be easy. And but there's very significant progress. And plenty of conflict coming. It's not going to be an easy struggle.
Well, both of you are very focused on that other uneasy struggle, and that is the struggle for survival of the human race on the planet. And I don't think I'm putting it too grimly. AOC, your first piece of legislation was that Green New Deal resolution, which imagined a kind of 10-year national mobilization. We're a few years into that 10 years. Your latest book, Noam, is called The Precipice, Neoliberalism, the Mobilization. I have the rest of the title here somewhere. Are we still at a point where we can avoid going over that precipice, Noam? Is it too late?
It's getting close. We have just been, I should say that Congresswoman AOC's resolution, recently reintroduced, is absolutely essential for survival. I'd actually like to know what you think the prospects are for moving it forward. Either something like that resolution will be implemented or we're doomed. It's that simple. Well, we still have time, not a lot. The longer we delay, the harder it gets. If we had begun to take the necessary steps 10 years ago, it'd be a lot easier. If we hadn't been the only country to refuse the Kyoto Protocol back in the early 90s, it would be far easier. The longer we wait, harder it gets. Now, if you look at the current circumstances, it's a little bit like white male supremacy. It's a mixed story. The PPC, the main scientific monitor, came out with their latest report on August 9th, the most dire yet by far. Said we have to start right now reducing fossil fuels year by year until by mid-century we essentially phase them out. Essentially, AOC's proposal, worked out in detail, can be done. It's feasible. What was the reaction? A couple of days later, President Biden issued an appeal to OPEC, the oil cartel, to increase oil production. It was then joined by the major powers, Europe, calling on the energy corporations to increase fossil fuel production. This is in response to the dire warning that we must start reducing them right now. Read the petroleum journals, euphoric, talking about new fields that they're discovering, new ways to exploit oil. The resolution agreement, again, I'd like to hear your opinion on this, but the Biden proposals did include not sufficient, but useful steps towards moving towards dealing with the climate crisis. All been eliminated. Can't put them through. Republicans, 100% denial. The right-wing Democrats, who are mislabeled moderate, are including the leading recipient of fossil fuel funding in the Congress, Joe Manchin, are blocking everything. Well, that's where we now stand. There are major popular forces working for this. Climate strike a couple of weeks ago, international, almost all young people. We have Greta Thunberg standing up at the Davos meetings where the great and powerful meet to congratulate one another and go skiing, telling them, how dare you? You have betrayed us.
And I have to say, Noam, I mean, we see brave, incredible, mostly people of color all across the country and the world putting up a serious fight and raising the alarm. But to ask your question of AOC, what are the chances we can get real change? I want to say in our lifetime, but we actually need it much, much sooner than that.
Well, I think one of the encouraging things and one of the I think guiding principles that we had in introducing the resolution was that by making the decision to formally introduce this as a resolution instead of as a bill, the intention of this was to release a blueprint for mass consumption in order for people to understand what it's going to take, the scale of action that is going to take just for the United States alone, let alone globally, in order for us to make the changes that need to be made in order to protect our society and our planet. And in that respect, I believe that it has been very successful, because even if we pass the resolution, the actual resolution itself, it is still a resolution in and of itself is a statement of the sense of Congress. It does not formally bind us, but what is incredibly encouraging is the mass adoption of this blueprint. And so once it was released and submitted to the House of Representatives and publicly available, we started to see movements across the United States that were undercover, that were not covered by media, but municipalities and states across the country started to adopt these targets on municipal levels. So you have the city of Los Angeles, you have Austin City Council introduced it, the state of Maine, New York City, and they started to adopt these more aggressive targets and they weren't waiting for federal action or legislation. So, what I think, though, is that we can't underestimate what we are standing up against. We know, and there's a popular sense and understanding that so much of Congress is captured by big money, dark money, Wall Street, and special interests. But what I don't think is as quite understood is that this money is oil money that fuels Wall Street, that captures Congress. And so when we talk about, Koch Industries and the Koch brothers who spent so many years trying to fuel right-wing movement in the United States, this is an oil baron family. They gain their immense wealth from control of critical means of energy production. And so as we see, they have captured the Republican Party, and they have also captured the critical margin of Democratic senators in order to block action. But what is also, what is so important to recognize is that our systems and our avenues for action are not just limited to electoralism. And when we engage as far as we can to the limits of electoralism, then we also re-engage in our capacities outside of our electoral systems, whether it's the withholding of labor or other sorts of grassroots actions, because there is also a point of collective action that becomes too difficult for the ruling class to ignore, because it then starts to threaten their legitimacy.
Let me ask you, Noam, to come in on this. I mean, the last part of your book title is The Precipice Neoliberalism, the Pandemic, and the Urgent Need for Radical Change. Where does that radical change come from, given the capture that the Congresswoman's described so well, and as you have over the decades?
Comes from where it's always come, from the population, from the victims, the part of the class war that has been stilled during the one-sided class war. We should remember, it's very interesting what's happening. Let me just add to what AOC said. Take West Virginia. The senator from West Virginia, the leading recipient of fossil fuel funding, is standing in the way of moving forward on climate change and many other things. His position, which is explicit, is basically that of ExxonMobil. His words, no elimination, just innovation. That's called greenwashing. Keep pouring fossil fuels into the atmosphere and hope that maybe someday somebody will figure out a way to get rid of some of the poisons. That's called responsible, socially responsible corporations. Well, take a look at the people of West Virginia. There actually are people, not just leaders. It's a coal mining state. United Mine Workers, representing them, recently agreed to a transition program which would move coal miners in West Virginia away from their destructive activities, destructive to themselves, to their communities, and of course to the world, moving away from that to moving towards renewable energy, better jobs, better communities, better life. That's the union representing them. I should say my co-author on the book on the Green New Deal, economist Paul Pollan, who's done a great deal of the work on this, was working with grassroots union groups in West Virginia, Ohio, California. Many of them are moving in this direction. Well, that's not a big surprise. Look back a little. The earliest people in the struggle for climate change were the labor unions. Tony Mazzocchi and the oil, chemical, atomic workers union. They were the first environmentalists back in the early 70s.
If you want a little bit more on Joe Manchin, I encourage you to go and look at the piece we did recently about how little he did when 2,000 union jobs at a generic pharmaceutical manufacturing factory were about to be offshored in the midst of this pandemic in Morgantown. Just saying. People can go check that out. Coming back to you, AOC, I mean, this must be one of those moments where it is terribly hard to figure out how to be an activist and also be in government. Because I remember when we talked, you had come from Standing Rock, you were inspired by activism out there. We should say there's lots of tribal nations who are leading the way on this environmental work. But it must be hard not to have your hair on fire in Congress. Mm-hmm. But in Congress, you do need to get things done to stay elected and to get reelected. And the changes that we're talking about take a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's extraordinary contradiction in day-to-day life as a person with an understanding of these systems, with contempt for the way a lot of these systems work, yet having to operate within them. And I think also one of the things that is inherently contradictory is that so much of our activism, it involves not a rejection of electoral systems, but a demand that electoral systems alone are insufficient, that there is a requirement of organizing and mobilization that goes beyond elections and goes beyond just our electoral systems. And that tension inherent is that there are some individuals of that school of thought that believe that means a rejection of electoralism, but others that understand that electoral politics is a part of this larger mobilization. It is not the sum of it, and it is not even all of it. And so as an elected official, I understand that so much of what happens in Congress is a result of an enormous amount of mobilization of pressure before legislation even meets the floor of the House. And in fact, the decisions about what gets to the floor of the House and what doesn't get to the floor of the House is a result of external mobilization. It is either a mobilization of capital or a mobilization of people.
That said, you described recently literally being in tears during one vote, a vote where you actually voted present on a bill that was going to support more weapons to Israel. Can you talk about that moment?
Yeah, I think what is often so difficult, especially being in the public eye, my job is to be held accountable and responsible by the communities that I represent. And it's very difficult to discuss publicly the human toll and the human cost of being in such a position, because it's, oh, well, this is your job. And, especially I think in digital spaces and mass media spaces, the flattening of people to their jobs or to their positions is quite normal. But the threats to our lives are very, very real. And kind of in the sequence of that week, at the beginning, Democratic Party leadership attempted to slip in this additional $1 to $2 billion for Israel's Iron Dome missile system in routine legislation, a continuing resolution legislation, whose intent is to just continue funding of our current operations the way that they have been funded as we negotiate the budget. So instead of doing that, they attempted to slip in additional funding into a continuing funding resolution. So I worked along with several others to strip and remove that funding at the beginning of the week. Now, I think this is when we saw like this very militant media mobilization that, in my view, started to extend far beyond the normal anti-Palestinian mass media into rhetoric that was direct threats to members of Congress's lives. In fact, even Haaretz, which is known as supposedly a quote-unquote progressive-leaning newspaper, on Tuesday ran an extraordinarily racist depiction of myself and other members holding Hamas rockets and firing them into Jerusalem. And this is, I think, at that time, I can disclose this now, but I couldn't then. I was assigned and I was riding around in a 20,000-pound armored vehicle because there was an extremely serious, credible threat that had been intercepted. And when you take all of that, combined with the fact that, after we had successfully removed that funding, Democratic leadership then decided they were going to force a singular vote on this one funding piece. The same week that we were voting on the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which this should have been in there and in our defense funding, they decided to pull out this supplemental funding, advance a narrative that was incredibly misleading, which is that this was the funding for the Iron Dome Israel self-defense system, which was a lie. This was supplemental to the full funding that Congress had already authorized, and create an extraordinary amount of panic among our Jewish community that has also been experiencing extremely targeted anti-Semitic attacks, along with our Muslim brothers and sisters in the community, all of us. I think the trauma of racism and bigotry in the last 4 years reached a breaking point. And they had scheduled the vote that morning, and the vote was set to be called within an hour. And, I work very hard to not just vote my conscience and not just vote what my beliefs are, but to organize our community in support of these ends. And this was an instance where I think that our community, as well as myself, in that in a human level, where it was caught on our back foot. And the calls that we received into our office were overwhelmingly, I believe, reactive to this misleading narrative. And we did not receive mobilization in our office in the way that we should have for the community to understand. And so, I've beaten myself up a great deal over it, but I also think that in the larger scheme of things, this was a battle in a larger context, in a larger struggle for the dignity and human rights of Palestinians and all people.
We'll put it in the links at our website, what you wrote about that vote, and come to you, Noam. I mean, thank you AOC, for laying all that out for us. And I utterly hear that it's painful and difficult. Your thoughts? No, I know you were watching.
Well, what AOC has brought up both in this comment and the preceding one is the interaction between mobilization and political action in Congress. And as she pointed out, the main part of politics is activism and mobilization. What happens in Congress is pale reflection, but it is a reflection. Now, there's a very interesting phenomenon concerning mobilization on this funding. The funding was for replenishment of the so-called Iron Dome. And there were very eloquent statements from people in Congress about how can we take away defense from people who are under attack. Notice what's happening. Did anybody get up and say, how about some defense for the people who are being attacked? Okay? The people who are being attacked are people in a prison, open-air prison, 2 million people, 1 million children, under vicious attack, constant attack. This particular case was just an escalation of the attack that goes on every day. U.S. weapons, high-tech weapons, they're to the point where they literally don't have water to drink.
You're talking about Gaza.
Gaza, of course, one of the worst human rights atrocities in the world. Children are dying because they can't drink water. Sewage systems are destroyed, power systems are destroyed, constant attacks, blockade, can't move. How about some defense for them?
Well, what about defense for people like yourself and AOC? I mean, we're not focusing solely on you as individuals, but the other thing that I heard in the Congresswoman's account just then was about the level of vitriol to the point of feeling one's life is under attack. You, Noam, are a great example of surviving decades of being under attack, and not all of it nonviolently. Can you talk about that? Because in a sense, you're an example of don't be afraid.
I could give you a long story about having to have police protection even at my own campus, but that's not important. What's important is let's focus on it. There's great passion about defending the perpetrators from retaliation, not a word about defending the victims from massive attack. That's a good example. That's very much like the system of markets that we were talking about before. You defend markets for the poor, not for the rich. They have to be protected from the ravages of markets. Another form of a kind of one-sided class war. And those are the things that we have to work on. Now, going back to, I think, AOC's most important point, the fact that mobilization and activism are the core of politics. There's very dramatic examples of that, which she was too modest to mention, so I'll mention it. The Sunrise Movement is one of at the forefront of activism on climate. They got to the point of civil disobedience, occupying congressional offices, occupying Nancy Pelosi's office, demanding change. Ordinarily, they'd just be thrown out by the Capitol Police. They weren't this time because one person from Congress came and joined them. AOC came to join them. They weren't thrown out, moved on. That's what led to Biden's climate program. Not great, but better than anything before. Well, that's an illustration of the point she was making. Popular activism interacting with supportive people in Congress can lead to results. And this is an old lesson. We should learn it. Take the New Deal, which greatly improved, a lot of flaws, greatly improved American society. How did it come about? It came about by a combination of militant labor action, CIO organizing, sit-down strikes, and a sympathetic administration. That combination is crucial.
AOC, you did that action that Noam just described in the first moments after your election victory. And you've sometimes said that part of your job is to retain that sense of outsiderism and freshness. How would you say you're doing on that front? And what is your vision at this point of the progressive agenda on the domestic side and also the foreign policy side? What are your biggest priorities?
Well, I think one of the things that we've been figuring out how to navigate is how do you go from pushing an opposition party under a neo-fascist administration to then essentially acting as the minority party within a governing party, and how you manage the tensions between activism and how we really expand the power and the potential of mobilization under those two different kinds of regimes. And I think one of the things that we've been successful at, and I think something that is very much a major victory that I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves, was this most recent showdown in Congress around the reconciliation and infrastructure fight. Because historically, the Progressive Caucus in Congress has been largely toothless, and it has essentially been more of a social club than a political caucus that can wield power. And because of that dynamic, this neoliberal and conservative corporate wing of the party has dictated the Democratic Party's agenda essentially without any sort of internal resistance for a very long period of time, save for a handful of people that didn't quite have the numbers. But what we experienced at the beginning of this month was a real transformative event in the history of the Progressive Caucus within Congress, where for the first 2 years that I was in office, it was essentially myself and 3 other congresswomen. Maybe we could get 5 others, and we have a numbers of maybe 10 people in the last Congress to be able to break with the party. And this most recent fight, the Progressive Caucus, which is 95 members out of the 218 needed to pass any legislation, galvanized, and they were willing to withhold their vote in order to ensure that the package with the greatest amount of benefits for most people, from labor, healthcare, childcare, educational protections to climate, was prioritized. And I think that came as a shock to the party. It came as a shock to mass media. They didn't know how to cover it. Many of them continue to try to adopt this tired narrative of a handful of progressive stragglers are troublemakers in the party. But the fact is that this very pro-corporate wing is a handful of people that are pursuing a path of obstruction, and they're tying themselves into knots to not say that. But I think that it is a precipitating event. And we are going to see if the Progressive Caucus takes this exercise of discovered power for working people and how they're going to apply it in the strategy moving forward. But I think in these conversations and in these meetings, at least in my interactions with other members of the caucus, I think it has been a revelatory moment. And just one last note, I think one thing that I think is so important is that all the time we tell working class people, you have more power than you think you do. Your essential labor withheld has more of an impact than you think. And I think sometimes even members of Congress take their own power for granted, because so much of what happens feels like it's at the whims of these larger social forces, of capital, of Wall Street, of party leadership. Rank and file members of the Democratic Party sometimes, I think, forget their own power, and they have discovered it in a way that I don't think many have felt before.
I don't think it's any coincidence that the chair of the Progressive Caucus now also, as you do, comes from activism, Pramila Jayapal, from immigration rights and other sorts of activism. Noam and AOC, we are drawing towards the end of this marvelous time that we've had together. I want to just end by asking you to talk about your vision for the future, Noam, and what leads you to think we can get there? You know, we've often heard the phrase "another world is possible" coming, from decades now, thinking that it's possible. We try on this program actually to name the moments that gave us the belief and the sense that it was palpable. Maybe somebody you met, something you did, something you witnessed, were involved in, but something that gave you that feeling that these huge changes that we're talking about can happen, are happening perhaps. No? Do you have a vision of a future? What is it? And any sense in your life, have you had the conviction that, yes, it's happening?
Started in the 1930s. I'm old enough to remember it. My family was first generation immigrants, working class, mostly unemployed, very hopeful. It's not like now. Much, in absolute terms, much worse than now. But in psychological terms, very different. There was a sense that we're working together, we can get out of this rotten conditions, but we're together. We have the militant labor action, we have political organizations, we have our groups, associations, working together with a somewhat sympathetic administration. We can get together and fight our way out of this. And they were right. They could. Not everything, but a lot of progress. That happens right throughout history. Take around 1960. A couple of black kids sat in a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, segregated lunch counter. Of course, immediately arrested and thrown out. Could have been the end, except the next day, a couple more came back. Pretty soon you had a few people coming from the north to join them. Pretty soon you had SNCC workers driving freedom buses through the South, trying to encourage a black farmer to take his life in his hands and go to register to vote. Pretty soon you had a huge movement, always like that. It's the people, you don't even know their names. Who knows their names? Nobody. But they're the people who make things happen and are the inspiration. Actually, my old friend, Howard Zinn, formulated this nicely. He said we should really honor the unknown, the countless unknown people whose work lays the basis that ultimately enter history. They're the ones who are inspiring, and they're the ones we should honor, respect, join, support.
AOC, your vision, your sense that it's possible, the vision.
Well, I think a lot of it actually, it overlaps with a lot with what Professor Chomsky just said, is that it is a transformation of our understanding and how history presents how change happens, as a number of notable individuals engaging and negotiating on behalf of everybody else, to the more accurate depiction of history, which is about mass mobilization that is often over-erased and under-discussed precisely because of how powerful and effective it is. And I think what gives me hope is that it's, there's the writing by Arundhati Roy, which is that another world is not only possible, but it is already here. And finding the pockets where this world has arrived is what gives me hope. The Bronx has one of the highest per capita rates of worker cooperatives in the world. That is a new economy in our borough of millions of people. And so whether it's that, whether it is discussions around mass incarceration, abolitionist organizing, not just, what does it mean to dismantle a jail, but what does it mean to reorganize a society so that we do not have people engaged in antisocial behavior on such a scale that we have today, or that we don't have antisocial systems. These are not just theoretical conversations that people are having, but there are communities that are actively experimenting and developing solutions. Also in the Bronx, we have anti-violence intervention programs where we've taken people who were once incarcerated and they are paid to mentor young people who are at risk of committing a crime that will put them in our system to be incarcerated for life. And we have reduced reoccurrence of violence by more than 50%. It's more effective than any police intervention that we know of at reducing violence, incidents of violence. And so to me, I think what I work on is not how do we find solutions, but how do we scale the solutions that we've already developed to transform our society. And that is work that breaks our cycles of cynicism. Cynicism, I think, is a far greater enemy to the left than many others, because it is the tool that is given to us to hurt ourselves. And hope creates action, and action creates hope. And that's how we scale forward.
Well, I think it was Arundhati that said, as you say, another world is not only possible it's happening on a quiet day. I think she said you can hear her breathing.
Yes.
And in this conversation, I've definitely heard her breathing. We will continue to report those stories that fly in the face of cynicism. I thank you both for your lifelong commitment to acting in ways that defy that cynicism, and appreciate that you chose to spend the hour with each other and with us at the Laura Flanders Show. Huge appreciation to you. Unless you have any closing comment or thing you want to say to each other, I know that we're at the end of our time that we had you commit to.
I'm just eternally grateful to both of you for taking the time. And I so sincerely appreciate it. Professor Chomsky, of course. And Laura, thank you so very, very much.
Keep struggling. It's crucial.
Keep up the struggle. All right. Thank you all so much.